Good morning. My name is Cyril O'Regan, Professor of Theology, University of Notre Dame. I welcome you all to this session, which has as its topic the response to the death of God as a cultural and discursive phenomenon. My sole qualification for being the person who introducing this session is, I suppose, that I'm to conduct the session in a timely fashion. Those of you who are graduate students of mine, and there are a few in the back, know that I have a remarkable incapacity to do that, never starting on time, and certainly have the peculiarity of never ending on time. In any event, quixotic as the decision is to have me up here, it is indeed my pleasure to introduce Professor Tristram Engelhardt. Now, providing a goodly imitation of a Renaissance man, Professor Engelhardt currently serves as Professor of Medicine, Obstetrics and Gynecology at Baylor University, while also serving as Professor of Philosophy at Rice University. Professor Engelhardt serves as editor and co-editor, or co-editor, of a number of prestigious journals, including Journal of Philosophy and Medicine and Christian Bioethics. In addition, he has served as editor of a series, Philosophy and Medicine, of which a mere 60 volumes have appeared thus far. Indefatigable in writing as well as editing, Professor Engelhardt has produced a score of books and over 250 articles. He still continues to write at an alarming rate of production, as if we were not embarrassed enough. His books include Bioethics and Secular Humanism, The Foundations of Bioethics. It has gone through a number of different editions and a number of translations, Chinese included. His most recent work is Foundations of Christian Bioethics. Professor Engelhardt will talk this morning. Is titled Hegel, Nietzsche, Vattimo, and John Rawls, Religious Discussion in the Public Forum After the Death of God. Professor Engelhardt.
Thank you for the very generous introduction. I must correct one or two points to begin with. One, I am at Baylor College of Medicine. Baylor, I have no animus and great fondness for Baylor University, but Baylor College of Medicine seceded from Baylor University, accomplishing what would be, depending on your theology, a divorce or nullification of a union once intact in 1967. So I am also overcome by laziness. I am now Professor Emeritus at Baylor College of Medicine, no longer having the stamina to respond kindly when people page me at 3 a.m. in the morning. I've had no calls for metaphysical crises, which is probably an indication of the decrepitude of our current civilization. A warning to begin with, I'm not a theologian. I'm too sinful to be a theologian. I mean that seriously. And so what I will do today is to talk about something I know little about, except what I've seen in others, that is, in the theologians I have met, and the holiness I have experienced in others. My teachers in grammar school always said, you're going to be boring, so tell people what you're going to say ahead of time, then they can go to sleep whenever they wish. What I'm going to do is begin by trying to give a diagnosis of our contemporary culture of death. Very much like Professor McElroy last night, I'm going to identify the culture of death with the emergence of a robustly agnostic culture, which defines the intellectual community of the West. I will indicate some of the radical consequences of that agnostic culture for the ways in which we understand morality and moral deportment. For those who have read Kant with care, they'll remember that Kant understands that once you no longer have the perspective of a personal, omnipotent, creative God, there is a tension that can arise between the good and the right, between moral rationality and prudential rationality, and between justification of moral statements and the motivation to be moral. Issues that he agonizes with in both the first critique, but also in the end of the second critique. He's trying to reassemble without God what once made sense, that is morality, grounded in a created God as a form of therapy that allows us in the end to come in union with that God. I will argue that what made our culture take the character that it did is a number of intellectual events and forces, one of which was, again, the moralization of religion by Immanuel Kant. Kant, in some sense, can be seen as doing the third Protestant Reformation, the second being that accomplished by the Pietists in the 17th century. What Kant does is try to suggest that the real focus of religion is upon being good or being just, not upon being holy. But of course, all of Christianity traditionally understood living the good life would not get you to heaven. You could live a fully good life, but that would not be enough if you were not holy. The second was accomplished by Hegel, the cultural reduction of theology, so that theology no longer is a claim on transforming our lives so we come in union with God, but it's an element, it's a constellation of images through which we understand the human enterprise. And the last, ultimate cosmic deorientation. As Vattimo points out, once you no longer know that there is a personal creator God who creates the universe and who in the end comes to judge it, the universe comes from nowhere, goes to nowhere, and for no ultimate reason. So it becomes very puzzling when people ask the question, now that we have germline genetic engineering, to what end and purpose should we direct human evolution, now that we can direct it? But if we think we live in a senseless universe, there is no sense, in an ultimate sense, to those questions. I will argue that the character of our culture of death is framed by two moral postulates. One is the agnostic moral postulate. The agnostic moral postulate means in polite intellectual conversations you never mention God. At the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association, if you constantly make references to God in terms of both your personal life and your intellectual reflections, you will be an oddity. Polite intellectual discourse requires exercising God from the community of our discourse. So the first is the moral agnostic postulate. You should act as if God does not exist. The second is the ecumenical postulate. Whenever you pray in public, or whenever you speak of God, speak in the most anonymous terms possible, so you'll offend no one by suggesting that your religion is better than theirs and that they should convert to yours. Of course, that's what I will enjoin you, that is, convert to mine. But anyway, my agenda of reform will be one that will say that in order to change the culture of death, we must do something that goes against both the postulate of agnosticism and of ecumenical politeness, and return worship and the pursuit of holiness and the production of saints to the core understanding of Christians. Only if we enter into the public space with right worship, only if we pursue holiness, and only if we produce saints and their relics to change the world, the cultural death will triumph. Now you will see here, I will come back to pick up a point made by Professor McInerney last night regarding natural theology. But you'll notice, as I talk about natural theology, it will sound very strange, because I will have an assumption, being an Orthodox Christian, that moral and natural theology are experiential. They're empirical, not sensibly empirical. They have to do with experiencing God. So the way in which one does natural theology is by worshiping God. Or as Orthodox like to say, you prove God's existence by worshiping him. So the final agenda point will be to transform the culture of death by producing saints. Now all of that is preface. You can now go to sleep as I take a sip of coffee and begin to read my whole lecture. All true Christian reform has its foundation in right worship, which is the basis of true theology and the guide for the development of morality. Yet this indispensable starting point for effective reform of our culture cannot be appreciated within the contemporary, dominant secular culture's fundamental commitment to eliminate the presence of God and authentic Christian worship from the public space. Contemporary discourse concerning the meaning of life and death is set within a context defined by the contemporary irrelevance of God. Already in 1802, Hegel understood the Western intellectual culture had come to ignore God. He also recognized, coining the term for the first time, the death of God, that, I quote, the death of God himself, that God himself is dead, an experience upon which the religion of most recent times rests. I close the quote. He understood that this marked the radical outcome of the Enlightenment and of the French Revolution. A liberal secular culture was emerging in which the worship of God had been radically marginalized, and where instead there was a growing faith in the capacity of humans within a secular moral vision to achieve a better world, one marked by liberty, equality, and justice. The eschaton would be realized imminently. It remained for Friedrich Nietzsche forthrightly to attack Christian symbol and sentiment, recognizing the full implications of the death of God for Western culture. With the death of God, previously established understandings of good and evil collapse or transform. Good and evil no longer possess a grounding in the being of the universe itself, as had been possible for traditional Christianity. Readers of Anscombe will remember that she makes this point in the 50s. It's like saying that criminal law remains after judges and prisons go away. Nor is there any longer a guarantee of harmony between the right and the good, between the so-called moral point of view and the perspective of individual or group prudential reason. Human nature, as we find it, is reduced to a contingent fact of the matter, without enduring significance. What had once been respected as reflecting the image of God is now the outcome of random forces in a universe that appears ultimately senseless. As Vattimo appreciates, the result is that the death of God is, to quote him, at once the culmination and conclusion of metaphysics, and at the same time the crisis of humanism. Close quote. With the death of God, things simply happen. The history of the cosmos and of mankind goes from no place to nowhere. There's a thoroughgoing cosmic deorientation. One is left unable to answer such pressing moral questions as the appropriate direction to which humans should guide their evolution. Mirabile factu, the goals and purposes of human evolution are rendered immanent, plural, and competing. Moral discourse after the death of God in a post-Christian, post-metaphysical context is reestablished within the horizon of finitude and immanence, and in the face of a plurality of competing narratives, none of which, in this context, can be recognized as ultimate. Confronted with this plurality of moral visions and the inability to choose among them without begging the question, arguing in a circle, or engaging in infinite regress, authority for moral action is, in this secular culture, inevitably derived by default from the only moral agents left within the horizon of finitude and immanence, humans. Humans, by default, are then left to their own devices to determine the content of their morality through socio-historically conditioned views of moral rationality. All is thus placed within the horizon of the finite without any notice of, much less regret for the loss of, the transcendent. John Rawls, for example, recognizes that he cannot anchor his moral account in God or even in Kant's aspirations to universal rationality. He makes do with reconstructing the grammar of public reason, understood within the context of a very particular view of secular, constitutional, social democratic society that forbids entry into public discourse of considerations that cannot be articulated in terms of its account of public reasons, that is, in terms of imminent, social democratically cognizable reasons. Rawls, like Hegel, has stepped back away from any metaphysical orientation of the moral life, and therefore from the possibility of an authentic public culture of life. The result is a view of the moral life committed to immanence, as well as to actively ignoring the transcendent. For public reason, all falls fully within immanent human reflection. There is no beyond transcending the being of the public space, to which one can make effective reference in that public space. Instead, one can only indicate how approaches to morality and justice are more or less one-sided or rationally incomplete. In this context, one can consider Rawls the great-grandchild of Hegel. For Rawls, without regret or sense of loss, transcendence has been relocated within immanence. The voice of man has become the voice of God, because the voice of God is now the voice of man. In this circumstance, Christians will be directed towards issues of social justice and away from the pursuit of the holy, within which context alone the meaning of justice can be adequately understood. Most significantly, any defense or criticism of a culture of life or death must in this public space be placed within the horizon of finitude and immanence. The culture of death is rooted ultimately in its having died to the presence of the living God. The culture of death is dead in its God-forsakenness. It is in therapeutic response to this diagnosis of the character of the culture of death that this paper is now turned. You now have survived the first section. What it does is to point out a 200-year history. It's 200 years ago that Galvin and this and Hegel talks about the death of God. He understands that the dominant Christianity of the time is going to continue in a sort of quasi-agnostic fashion, trying to turn to issues of social concern while rendering the transcendent immanent. One of his students, called Rosenkranz, is one of the people who in the 1840s talks about this with great passion, undoubtedly a person against whom Soren Kierkegaard directs his response, a person who understands, called Rosenkranz, the cultural transformation of Christianity. Second section. All true reform begins with right worship. Right worship is cardinal to any authentic agenda of reform because all moral progress is tied to theological progress, and all theological progress is personal. After all, the first commandment is, thou shalt love thy God with thy whole heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. Because the second commandment is like the first and dependent upon it, the moral life is radically distorted in one side in the absence of first rightly obey the first commandment. A culture of life can only be adequately understood, realized, and nurtured within a more encompassing culture of worship aimed at union with God. This view of morality and theology is admittedly not prominent in the West. However, it was central to the Christianity of the first millennium and is still to Orthodox Christianity today. For example, in speaking of the moral life and of our moral development through keeping God's commandments, St. Basil the Great recognizes that God has put in us the power of love. This power grows through right action and right worship. Quoting from St. Basil, by means of this power rightly and properly used, we pass our entire lives holily and virtuously, but through a perverted use of it, we gradually fall prey to vice. Close quote. As Archimandrite Ephrem, abbot of the monastery of Vattimo on Mount Athos, stresses, the keeping of the commandments and the living of a moral life are intrinsic to the cure of the corruption of our nature, so as to bring man into union with God. To quote from Ephrem, the commandments are the therapeutic cure for a complete recovery from the corruption of our nature. The keeping of the commandments is the precise means of communion between the personal God and man. Now, this probably sounds bizarre to you. It's to tell you that the commandments exist to cure our fallen nature. They're not something external. The reason you use them is to cure your nature. It's the whole model then of sin is not the model of having committed a crime, like Texans do often as you read the news, and whether you can find yourself exonerated from that crime, but whether you have failed to aim flawlessly at God. For sin is hamartia, falling short of the mark. That's why sins can be voluntary or involuntary, in knowledge or in ignorance. It doesn't matter why you're missing the mark. If you miss the mark, you miss it. And the commandments are our way of re-aiming ourselves at the mark. That's why the whole thought about morality is different in this context. It's curative. It's not something that has a sort of goodness in itself. That's why also the great saints say in great difficulty, every now and then, unlike Augustine of Hippo, do lie, tell a falsehood with an intention to deceive, because that's what you have to do in that circumstance, and then take treatment. Our dominant culture is not directed to holiness and virtue, but widely employs, or at least considers as possibly appropriate, many activities radically at odds with traditional Christianity's affirmation of life. If one understands the culture of life as affirming all the ways we turn to God in making life flourish, our culture is quite distant. If one understands the culture of life as affirming a moral vision that rejects abortion, sexual relations outside the marriage of a man and woman, and positions such as suicide and euthanasia, then our culture falls radically short of the mark. Our society widely accepts abortion, is divided as to whether marriage is restricted to the union of a man and woman, and contemplates the appropriateness of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. At the same time, it is deeply puzzled regarding the moral propriety of cloning and the use of germline genetic engineering to redirect human evolution. The battles and the cultural wars reflect fundamentally different views as to how humans should understand individual conduct and community life, as well as the purpose and significance of human existence. This fundamental discordance of traditional Christianity and post-traditional, post-Christian culture is grounded in more than a failure rightly to apply a common moral principle to particular activities, well, here I'm glossing the Summa, or in the blotting out from the human heart of essential moral insights. Blindness to a rightly directed moral life involves, more fundamentally, a failure to live in that relation of grace to which Thomas Aquinas only obliquely makes reference in quoting Peter Lombard's gloss to Romans 2:14, when Aquinas attempts to account for how the natural law can be abolished from the human heart, as in perverse cultures like in Texas. Lombard appears to recognize the restorative role of grace and the difficulties with perverse cultures of recognizing the requirements of natural law. Given the character of the passage, grace appears to be construed as created rather than as uncreated, obscuring the central importance of union with God to the appropriate and full appreciation of the culture of life. Elder Joseph the Hesychast, one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, emphasizes how the moral life must be understood as leading to holiness. And I quote, "Once a man has crossed over to God through submission and obedience with right faith, he goes on to encounter him and to abide permanently with him, and this is properly called theology." St. Paul makes a similar point when he underscores that in the absence of a rightly ordered spiritual life, there is a distortion of the capacity to know rightly concerning moral issues. St. Paul connects a pagan life of worship with the growth of perverse sexual passions and immoral dispositions. It is important to note that St. Paul, in the first chapter of Romans, associates the beginning of the pagans' perversity in their failure of worshiping rightly, and to the reasonings of the pagans. He connects these reasonings to a phrase suggesting that he has philosophizing in mind, telling you what trouble you can get into from taking philosophy courses, when he speaks of their professing to be wise, sophoi. It is worshiping wrongly that leads to their distorted moral understanding and perverse passions. The point is that those who live outside of a community rightly worshiping God will systematically misperceive the proper content of morality and then be tempted to give an intellectual justification for that misperception. The question was raised to Professor McInerney last night. Well, so many people know that God exists, and then they affirm what we know to be a culture of death. Aristotle had good proofs for the existence of God, and then affirmed abortion, and Plato seems to have affirmed both abortion and infanticide. How can you know about God and not know about the culture of life? And the answer is, knowing about God doesn't help you at all unless you worship God rightly. Cicero, who talked a lot about morality, and as a Stoic, in some sense believed in God, surely it was also a person who endorsed limited infanticide. The life of worship and the moral life are tightly interconnected. For traditional Christians, this connection between right worship and rightly ordered moral life has empirical plausibility. Look around you. It is primarily traditional Christians who appreciate in its fullness an authentic culture of life. As a matter of the sociology of moral views, outside of the context of traditional Christianity, there's a departure in part or in whole from those norms that Christians traditionally affirm is essential to a culture of life. This cleft between traditional Christian and post-traditional societal norms is unavoidable, given the human moral epistemological predicament after the fall, which has clouded the heart's ability to see truly. Here, a footnote. Realize that among the differences separating Orthodox Christianity from the Church of the West is what happened at the fall. The West generally looks at the fall as having an impact upon the will. Think of Texas politicians. You hand them a bribe, the passion of the money in front of the bribe and other elements going along with the bribe, they have a great deal of acrasia. They just can't do anything but say, hand me the bribe, let's go to the party. So what the Western account of the catastrophe of the fall is it's primarily upon the will. And to try to solve that is all the debate between the Pelagians and the Augustinians, whether you can turn to God on your own, or whether you can not only turn to God on your own, but carry on the issue of salvation by yourself. Orthodox Christians remain semi-Pelagians. You can turn to God without His grace. You just can't carry it through without God's grace. But the real bad thing about the fall wasn't that you had all the passions of Texans, but that your heart was no longer open. You no longer saw God. The understanding is that there's a human faculty of the nous where you both see God and see nature, and you see things truly. And all of theology is the restoration of the ability for Adam and Eve to see as they once saw before the fall. So, again, this clash between traditional and post-traditional societal norms is unavoidable given the human moral epistemological predicament after the fall, which has clouded the human heart's ability to see truly. Sound, rational moral argument requires not only logical consistency, but true premises. The problem is, where do you get the true premises and know that they are true? Which in turn require reliable rules of moral evidence. However, moral viewpoints are separated by different rankings of moral goods and principles so that one must agree at the outset regarding basic premises and rules of evidence. As a result, discursive, rational arguments to establish a particular morality go in a circle, beg a question, or engage in infinite regress. A similar state of affairs besets much of academic moral theology, which takes as a point of departure data drawn from the scripture, the writings of the fathers, and oral tradition, as well as from philosophical argument, placing all this within various competing philosophical interpretive frameworks. Depending on the philosophical framework chosen, a theological school will develop its particular moral theological account of proper moral deportment and human flourishing. Such accounts inevitably become hostage to what is at the time academically fashionable. Therefore, one would expect exactly what one finds. Academic moral theology, like moral philosophy, moves with the conceits of the age, making it difficult to discern what should count as a normative understanding of the culture of life. As a result, it becomes impossible to articulate a reform of the culture of death in this circumstance that is not itself already co-opted by the culture in need of the reform. That is what one would expect given the character of our culture and the bond between right worship and moral development. That is, if you cannot break through evidence through transcendence, you'll never know which premises to begin with or how it is that you have evidence of the truth. It is only in terms of a rightly ordered relationship to God, which includes rightly directed worship, that the moral life can be well directed, yet neither the Christian God nor rightly ordered worship has a place in the public space. We've finished the second section. We're halfway through. A striking feature of contemporary public intellectual discussions of moral matters is that they are generally conducted, as I point out, without reference to God. This is not to deny that many in public fora, Americans, for example, show themselves consistently in-your-face believers in God in ways rare in most Western European polities. I'm a Texan, that's why I say, they sing "God Bless America" when they recite their Pledge of Allegiance. They claim their country to be one nation under God. Pace, agnostics, and atheists, there's still an American civil religion expressed in sincere public prayer. However, powerful this religious folk culture is, it does not represent the dominant intellectual culture, the culture within which matters of serious public policy are elaborated. There the discourse is normatively agnostic. It is this intellectual context that frames the lives of most universities and therefore the education of most students. The perspective of the dominant intellectual culture seeks to be free of any reference of God. Second, when public reference is made to God, it occurs within the context of a strategically ecumenical religious discourse. For those who pray at public events, it has become de rigueur to do so as if religion did not concern matters of fact, but rather matters of cultural concern and celebration. The result is a foundational transformation of the character of public religious ceremonies, so as to avoid the impression that religion involves matters regarding which one could decisively, and with important and enduring consequences, be right or wrong. One is constrained to discuss matters of faith as if they were not important in the ways in which serious believers know them to be important. That is, important on a par with distinguishing between good and bad surgical interventions. The result of this state of affairs is that, with respect to religion, public life is guided by what might be termed two crucial public moral postulates that define public discourse and conduct. First, the agnostic moral postulate. One acts and speaks as if the cosmos were without enduring purpose. This postulate requires that public discussions be conducted as if there were no God, and therefore as if one were confronting the task of making sense of human life within an ultimately senseless universe. Reflections on the purpose of human life, human community, the content of morality, and human collaboration are undertaken as if neither the universe nor humans possess an ultimate purpose. Secondly, the ecumenical religious postulate. One acts and speaks as if religious concerns did not involve matters of fact. In particular, the ecumenical postulate demands that one talk of religion as a matter regarding which one cannot be right or wrong, as, for example, one can be right or wrong with respect to which medical procedures are beneficial or harmful. This state of affairs has important roots in the cultural history of the West. These two secular moral postulates reflect the Enlightenment's marginalization of religion and the church, and it's erecting in its place a moral and political vision freed of superstition and grounded in secular public reason. In part, this involved 1, the moralization of religion, 2, the cultural reduction of theology, and 3, the cosmic deorientation of experience and history. To remind you, this view of culture, which lies at the foundations of the secular culture of death, by affirming these three developments, creates an agnostic view of how one should conduct public discussion and experience. The three postulates, again, here, the two postulates of the Gnostic postulate and the ecumenical postulate, turn on these developments to which I made reference in the introduction. One, the moralization of religion. In great measure, as I point out, Kant affected the Third Protestant Reformation when he attempted to articulate the public value of Christianity in terms of its moral implications. The force of this position is that religion is concerned with the good and social justice, not the holy, with the consequence that it should not matter, according to this account, as to what religion one belongs, as long as one lives a morally good life committed to justice, fairness, and the pursuit of beneficence. You're a true Kantian when you tell people it doesn't matter what religion you belong to as long as you live a good life. That's full Kantianism. Two, the cultural reduction of theology. Hegel recognized that the final outcome of the Enlightenment was that the substance of theology was recast, so that religion's higher truth was construed to be its cultural significance, not its transcendent significance. As Emil Fackenheim perceptively notes, for Hegel, the Christian God is, and I quote, the last of all gods who exhausts all religious possibilities. Hence, this last God points to a radically post-religious future, and the bourgeois Protestant human freedom already points to a radical secular freedom which is yet to become actual. What Fackenheim is picking up with Hegel is this notion of the opening light of the post-Napoleonic liberal Europe, where one would be able to marginalize the transcendent claims of religion. And the last, the cosmic deorientation of existence in history. After the culture of death, it is no longer possible in the dominant culture to discern an ultimate purpose and direction in one's heart turning to God, in human nature and cultural history. The result is that even talk of human dignity must be radically recast in immanent human terms. Once human dignity is placed within the horizon of the finitude, human dignity is no longer grounded in the status conveyed to humans by God through creation in his image, and through the incarnation bringing man the opportunity to become gods by grace. Instead, human dignity is radically reduced to concerns regarding the achievement of certain goods, as well as regarding what precludes one from rashly holding oneself to be blameworthy, a la Kant. If human dignity is a reconstruction of human reflection in an ultimately senseless universe, its moral weight is radically circumscribed and immanentized. I presume you all have read, or some of you have sullied your minds with the writings of pragmatists such as Rorty. Rorty tells us that we can proceed only if we exercise from the way we approach the world any notion of the divine voice in morality. Morality is a construction of humans, and this cosmic deorientation fully recasts all the terms that we've used before, including human dignity. In this cultural context, reflections concerning the culture of life and the culture of death are destined to have a truncated character. They are resolutely placed within the horizon of finitude and immanence, discounting all reference to ultimate meaning. Yet, if one is attempting to make sense of human life in a universe where, in fact, all makes ultimate sense, only if it is related to the personal creator God, while nevertheless acting as if humans lived in a senseless world, one will twice over critically misperceive the character of an authentic culture of life. One will have failed to have opened one's heart to God. One will not recognize that who, in terms of which all is given significance and direction, one cannot make adequate sense of a culture of life if one blinds oneself to the central goal of all life, worship of God. At stake here is an understanding of theology in general, and natural theology in particular, that places praxis centrally. One recognizes that theology and philosophy are par excellence empirical or experiential undertaking. This is not to claim that they are dependent on sense data, but rather on noetic experience, that experience uniting the theologians of traditional Christianity and the unbroken experience of God. One might note that probably half of the great theologians of the Orthodox Church of the 20th century never completed secondary education, yet they knew theologically, realizing the sixth beatitude, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. If this understanding of natural theological epistemology is correct, then the infirmity of contemporary culture in great measure is dependent on its failure to understand what it is to come to know God, or for that matter, to produce true theologians. This claim regarding the foundations of natural theology recasts how one should understand the field, as well as what one should expect from natural theology. One proves the existence of God by worshiping him. The proof given is not simply that one shows forth the presence of God in the world in the sense of witnessing to his presence and dedication of his life to him, which is undoubtedly a significant element of public instruction, but most importantly, that through right worship one comes radically to experience the living God. In this sense, natural theology is analogous to a laboratory science, although the laboratory for the science is the very heart of man. The fathers recognized that theology and philosophy, properly understood, are not at their core mere bodies of reflection, but ways of life about which one can reflect at a secondary level. Core is the doing that brings one to experience God. It must be understood here that a radically different epistemology is at stake, one that recognizes that the fall obscured but did not extirpate the nous, that power through which one can, like the unfallen Adam, see rightly both God and nature, and which lies at the core of the doing of all true theology, including natural theology. This epistemology offers quite a different account of the character of the culture of death. The culture of death will triumph as long as humans worship God wrongly, and as a result turn to their own neighbors in wrongly directed love. The mere intellectual affirmation of the deity or the wrongly directed worship of the deity will not restore a rightly appreciated culture of life. One may think here of St. John Chrysostom's commentary on the famous passage of Romans 12:14-15 regarding the energia of the law written on the hearts of Gentiles. St. John Chrysostom underscores that the Greeks, or the Gentiles, and I quote, that Paul here means, not them that worshipped idols, but them that adored God, that obeyed the laws of nature, that strictly kept all things save the Jewish observances, which contributed to piety, such as were Melchizedek and his, such as were Job, such as were the Ninevites, such as were Cornelius. So it's not all who find in their heart the guidance of God, but only those who worship rightly. Indeed, St. John Chrysostom indicates that it is only through faith that the natural theological capacity to see the world as created is developed. By faith, he does not mean simply the disposition to act as if God existed, or to affirm certain articles of dogma, but rather deliberate uniting in the heart to God that transforms the heart so that one can see. St. John Chrysostom argues, for example, the greatest things are attained through faith, not through reasoning. Whence does it appear that God made all things? He's saying you can't prove the existence of God from creation. Reason is not suggested. No one was present when it was done. Whence is it shown? It is plainly the result of faith. Through faith we understand that the worlds were made. Why through faith? Because the things that are seen were not made of things that do appear. On the other hand, St. John Chrysostom rejects the capacity of discursive reason to recognize creation as created and to disclose the creator God. Yet on the other hand, he recognizes that we have a capacity to see the creator in creation, which capacity sees rightly only within right worship. It is precisely this failure to cultivate right worship that lies at the core of the culture of death. This failure to cultivate right worship is in part rooted in the claims made by the agnostic postulate as well as by the ecumenical postulate. In the intellectual public forum, one is, as far as possible, to speak of matters of God as if God did not exist. And when one speaks of matters of religion, one is to speak of these matters as if they were not matters about which one could be right or wrong. Once it was the case that the centrality of worship to a cultural life was obvious. Institutions of higher learning took pains not merely to balance the sciences with the humanities, they also understood that learning rightly required praying well. There was an appreciation that instruction in philosophy, religion, or theology is radically one-sided and incomplete when not theologically located within a life of prayer and worship. It is in this light that one should understand the traditional Christian private school requirement of mandatory attendance at chapel services. A recent biography of Pierre Goodrich, the founder of the Liberty Fund, which is in Indianapolis, notes that he lost interest in Wabash College and resigned as a trustee in 1970. When the Wabash Faculty Administration voted to discontinue a twice-weekly religious service on the grounds that, quote, it no longer served an educational phenomenon to the students. Bad English and bad judgment. In a secular world, appreciating culture and cultivation in terms of a commitment to prayer and worship is at best countercultural. The idea that prayer, fasting, and almsgiving are central to philosophical and theological development is likely to engender puzzles, if not laughter. The culture of life is the culture of rightly ordered life with the living God. Any adequate agenda for reforming the culture of death must begin with producing persons who can reorient the dominant culture. Such individuals can be nothing less than those who succeed, at least in part, in achieving a theological or saintly way of life. For the culture of death to be overcome, one must do so in the old-fashioned way, by producing those who live the culture of life, namely saints. Nothing less will do. It is informative that in the history of the church, the name theologian has only been given to three people. St. John the theologian, whose feast we kept yesterday, St. Gregory the theologian, and the last, St. Simeon the new theologian, who lived from 949 to 1022. A man who would answer complicated questions regarding the Trinity by going home at night, experiencing the Trinity, and then answering the next morning. To reform the culture of death, one will have to produce persons who incorporate fully the culture of life. The agenda of reform of the culture of death must be an agenda for producing saints who live in the life of God in his uncreated energy. It will not do merely to produce individuals who are good or engaged in the pursuit of social justice. For more, one will need to produce those who incarnate holiness. This will not be able to do without recalling all to a life of asceticism and worship, which is at the core of the traditional culture of life. At the least, one will have to begin against great odds to shoulder the project of reintroducing the presence of a worshipful acknowledgement of God in the public space. For he is Lord not only of our private lives, but of the world at large. This will be countercultural. Metropolitan Vlachos reminds us of the importance of saints for the 21st century. Saints, he says, according to St. Simeon the new theologian, are those who have acquired the whole Christ within them, wholly by work and experience and perception and knowledge and vision of him. From this witness it seems clear that saintliness does not have an abstract and ethical meaning. Saintliness is participation in the uncreated deifying energy of God, and the person deified is a saint. Saints are those who have experience and knowledge and perception and vision of God. They are not simply good people. As we turn to the culture around us and turn to its reform, we now have to think about what it is to create saints and relics. Now the last section, it is brief. In a world that is in fact intimately connected to a personal creator God, and in which nature is a window open to that God, secular space will allow at best a radically one-sided and incomplete presentation of the culture of life. Vattimo, unlike Rawls, perceives the radical shift in meaning that has occurred. Any reform of society will require Christians to re-enter the public space as rightly worshiping Christians, to speak and act not in religiously anonymous terms, but in authentic Christian terms. Christians will have to violate the established secular norms for appropriate action and discourse in the public forum in order to acquaint their fellow citizens with the circumstance that neither the good the just, much less the culture of life, will be adequately understood or make sense outside of a correct understanding of an authentic, worshipful pursuit of holiness, within which, and only within which, all can make sense. Christians will have to recall as many as possible to that public space, to that unique community of the church, within which alone the pursuit of the good is finally appreciated rightly within right worship. In short, one will only rightly understand the appropriate content for a culture of life when one has embedded morality in a rightly ordered pursuit of holiness. The moral life is hierological in its foundation. Christians must, through right worship, sanctify the world. Thank you very much.
Let me thank Professor Engelhardt for his recommendation, for his diagnosis, for the range of the paper, for the stimulation of the paper, the incisiveness of the paper, and what I hope is the controversial aspects of the paper. What I will do is that I will not field the questions, but I will conduct the fielding of the questions. So we'll get to that and we'll proceed. Go ahead.
These comments are offered sympathetically, so I hope you receive them that way, because I notice you have your cowboy boots on, and I don't have any shin guards. So, to strengthen your argument concerning the relationship between liturgy and morality, natural theology traditionally has three components that we can think of them. That there's a question concerning God. Does God exist? Questions concerning what this being is, and then finally, right relations with this being. So the right relations with this being, those questions are ethical right away. And so to err there already is to err ethically. And those questions, I think, we could call them liturgical in a broadly construed sense. So that it seems to me that that really strengthens this motif going through your paper. And what are your thoughts about that?
Very helpful question. Forgive me if I try to turn it on its head. Natural theology begins in right relations to God. It's experiential. It doesn't begin there. It will not know the God it is proving or reflecting upon. It's as if I would come home from my many travels. Someplace in this audience was my wife earlier, and she came up with 5 proofs for my existence. If that happened, I would know things had really gone wrong. If Christians are making proofs for the existence of God and not experiencing Him, something's really gone wrong. Surely one reflects upon the experience of God which is given through as the fruit of right worship. But those reflections are secondary to the experience itself. Natural theology is to turn through a moral choice to worship God rightly. Now, that's, again, I'm recasting moral theology as fundamentally experiential. It starts off with the living God's being experienced by the theologian. That's why theologians, in the strongest sense, need not be academics. Theologians are people who know God like my wife knows me. And it would be the greatest of blasphemy to think of giving a proof. Notice what I'm doing is getting to think about theology in a way that has not been thought of in the West, maybe since the Ninth Ecumenical Council. Remember the fight that took place in the 14th century when the Ninth Ecumenical Council was held in 1341, 1347, and 1351, and affirms St. Gregory Palamas over against scholastics say, true theology is experience. This is the core. In absent that, you will always go wrong. Now, that understanding of theology is the one I'm laying out. It may be one so bizarre to you that you think that you shouldn't come closer. But it's to say that the way the culture of life is founded is to have a living experience of God. And then philosophers come in and theologians of the second grade and reflect upon those who've achieved theology. Now, one would hope that those would also be able to achieve theology. I hope that just because I'm an academic, I'm not condemned to hell. But I do know the temptations are significant.
I think you're second.
Yes, I want to raise a question about sectarianism. The position that you're advancing on natural theology as experiential, I understand that to be interior, if not interior to a particular person, then interior to a particular religious sect. And when you speak of religious worship, right worship, I presume you mean your own. And those who do not share your faith will say their own in turn. One of the things that came out of the West, following all those terrible religious wars, was the liberal idea of toleration. And it seems to me, as much as I agree with so much of what you say, 90% of it, that the liberal idea of toleration is one of the important developments, one of the great achievements of this culture that you've been speaking against. Isn't your view ultimately dependent upon a strong sense of religious toleration within society if there's to be peace among competing sects of religion?
You've asked about 2 or 3 very important questions. The first one has to decide what counts as toleration. As that was understood in the 16th and 17th century, it wasn't that I agree with you, I just won't use force against you. In the core notion of intellectually respectable toleration is that your views are horrible, your religion is misguided, but I won't do anything to you. Think about how it's done on a medical level. I'm a physician, and I often have people come and tell me about the herbalist they've gone to. Now, I don't think the herbalist is necessarily a fraud, nor do I think that the herbalist wishes evil to the patient. But they will often make claims I know to be false. Toleration means I respond with love about the herbalist. I say, the herbalist is misguided. Imagine someone comes to me and tells me, you know, comes to a patient who has subacute bacterial endocarditis. We know that brought uniform death before the advent of antibiotics. Imagine a herbalist says, you know what you really need is vitamin C. Now, what it means to tolerate this view is I don't beat the person up. I don't even get angry at them. I just say, you're misguided. That's what toleration meant. That issues of what was the best therapy to get you to heaven was more important than understanding what antibiotics would work. And that you owed people a frank view. You're a nice guy, but your religion is misguided. With the same sort of love that you would hope that I would respond to the herbalist who is telling the person with subacute bacterial endocarditis, quit taking the antibiotics, they're all unnatural, chew this stuff. So that's historically the meaning of toleration. The perversion of the meaning of toleration is I no longer have opinion. You know, maybe the grass is good for you and just the antibiotics are for me. Now, when you begin to think of that as kind of ridiculous, then you can imagine an ecumenical meeting of physicians, herbalists, and all, and sort of each one talks, but no one says anything critical of each other, and then I think you've got to my ecumenical postulate. Now, which religion is right is a matter of ultimate concern. You might, something like St. Vincent of Morin, ask what religion is the same over space and time, with no central authority, believing one way and understanding about that worship. And that might get you to suspect that their theologians are talking to the same God, and maybe then you'd try their medicine. Good question.
Next question. Next.
It seems to me that in casting the culture of death in terms of a lack of right worship, that there's a larger concept you're appealing to as the culture of death, right? I mean, it's not just specifically what's been going on in the 20th century, but really what's been going on as part of the human condition, right? I mean, where you have in the human condition a lack of right worship of God that will follow this culture of death, are you describing something closer to the fall, or are you putting the culture of death in terms of the fall?
Again, number of questions. I'm using culture as a way of cultivating us. How institutions will cultivate us a culture of life opposed to a culture of death. And they're competing institutions, and in different times of history, the dominant institutions may either be agnostic or theistic. So I presume that after the fall, there's a lot of competition amongst different cultures. Secondly, I presume that the culture of death is nothing new. I mean, there's nothing that we're doing now that wasn't done in the Roman Empire with abortion, infanticide, physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia. Any belief that this is something new means you didn't pay attention to the history of thought. It's nothing new. Now, what I'm saying is that you'll never get right what it is wrong with the culture of death if you don't recognize that core to it is dying to God and his claims on us. And that the culture of life is to come into union with that being who is the purpose and source of everything. If you don't do that, you'll get nothing right. That's the argument. If God exists, and if God's person, if he creates the world, and you live your life ignoring that, you'll be sensu stricto in a hell of a fix. Now, so the argument is that you should turn to God to get your culture of life right. Now, that seems to me would not be implausible traditional Christians and Jews, since the first commandment is to love God with all your heart, and all your mind, and all your soul. And if you don't do that right, you'd presume everything else would go wrong. Every way you would do your pursuit of justice or the good would be perverted.
Back and then here, and then we go over this way. As you're talking about, as you're arguing for theology as experience, I'm thinking about my students as I teach a historic Christian theology class, an ethics class, and a cultural apologetics class. One of the main things against which I'm struggling is to overcome their experience orientation. For many of them, there's been this separation, this divorce between faith and reason. And many of them are guided by the subjective, and I'm trying to encourage them maybe to move in the opposite direction, though I may be misunderstanding your overall argument. And as they conceptualize worship, very often they're approaching it from the standpoint, what can I get out of this? How can my needs be served? And lastly, I guess my misgivings arise out of the concern that perhaps we're feeding into we are becoming a part of the predominant ethos of our culture, which is postmodern, radically preoccupied with the experiential and the subjective. So, could you simply address that?
Very good question. When I finish, let me go back and ask whether I've answered the question. Medicine is not an a priori science. However, it is not subjective. Medicine is an experiential endeavor, but it's not what feels good to you. So if I had a resident who came to me, let's go back to the person with subacute bacterial endocarditis, and says, I don't really feel like giving antibiotics. Let's just wait and see. My answer would be, I don't care what you feel. Experience has shown that antibiotics work. So you understand that you can appeal to science and experience within a framework and by no means be subjective. Now, I take the claim I've made is that theology requires curing the human heart. And Christians have, over the last 2,000 years, done it the same way. That is, they understand that you have to begin by fasting, prayer, asceticism, worship. And you'll know when it works when you become holy and the world changes around you. That reliably produces saints. Produced saints in the 20th century, produces saints now in the 21st century. And it's not a claim about what you feel like. It is to take on the mind of the fathers and to live in it and to become a saint. And by your works, their works, you shall know them. And so you'll tell your students that people will know when they made it, when they begin to glow in the dark and miracles happen. They ought to produce saints. It's not what you feel, it's what you do. It's no different from a medical claim. It just doesn't presume it's based on sensory data, but how you can open the human heart, the nous.
The second person definitely.
At least you have to agree with me. Do you understand why that is not a subjective claim? Okay.
Actually, you just answered my question. I would like to thank our nice cameraman who has been wonderful and been following this whole thing to point to deal with crucifix and concrete at the end of the talk. They've been there all along. Do I take the last part of your talk to mean that to become a saint it's not necessarily a sufficient criteria to be observably, in the public sense, good, but maybe it's not even an essential criteria?
A very important question. At this point, I'll sound like a homilist. Truly, it's not a sufficient condition. If you mean by good loving your neighbor as yourself, because you must first love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and if you don't do that, you'll neither love your neighbor rightly, nor have done what is necessary to come in union with God. So doing the good, which falls on the second commandment, will always be misguided and never enough unless you have done the first. So living a good life is not enough. People can be very good, sell all they have, give to the poor, be burnt if they don't have the love of God which transforms them. It ain't going to count. As we would say in Texas, that dog don't hunt. We are not justified by good works. We are not justified by the merits of our works. Our works show forth a will that truly loves God. And that's why the thief on the cross who did no good work is the first person to go into paradise. He stole it. He stole it by a faith that was full, and he first walked again like Adam in paradise. It's that goodness. It's not the mitzvah that get us to heaven, but we're justified by faith, but only a faith that will, if it's given opportunity, to have full expression in good works.
Here first, then we go to line.
Let me begin by saying, as a fellow Texan, I appreciate your uplifting remarks about that.
As you know in the scripture, Christ came for sinners, not the righteous, and so he must be having attention to Texas, right?
Many of us come from Christian colleges and universities. I'm wondering what, and the title of this conference is Agendas for Reform. In light of your provocative thesis, I wonder if you might explore what are the implications of that thesis for Christian colleges and universities. In what way, if any, ought they to be reformed? To what extent do they contribute in the production of saints?
We're created to worship God for all eternity. A university should acquaint people with that. It should help them to understand that the first commandment is to worship him rightly with all one's heart and all one's soul and all one's mind. And if one's not going to do that, one's whole life is going to go misspent. And that has to be taught not just as an intellectual proposition. People have to be brought to worship. They have to see people who worship. And they have to see that worship transforms.
So, for example, would you, if you were the president of a Christian college, see it important that the faculty that are going to be hired are parts of worshiping communities?
Absolutely. If you're going to sell McDonald's, you can't have people going out selling tacos from Taco Bell. I mean, they've got to understand this is where it's at.
Part of the tenure process?
Surely. I mean, that's why Christian universities exist. I belong to a secular university. Secular universities don't know what anything's about, so they can't put that in their tenuring process. You would hope that Christian universities understand that the most remarkable fact of all human history is that the Messiah of Israel has come and he's the living Lord Jesus Christ, and we shall worship him. Now, if that's not part of a Christian university, I don't know why anyone would give a dime to its support or send their children there.
What changes would you suggest in curriculum?
I think people have to understand the unbroken continuity of Christianity. It's good for them to see that it is not something created in the 20th century or in the 16th century or in the 13th century. It is one and unbroken. They should know it. They should know the Apostolic Fathers. They should know the Fathers. You should see the unbroken community, which we are. And they should see that and live in it. And then the worship services should be such where all of this is sung by them. So they live it in all heart and mind. Because only if you live it in all heart and mind will you produce the saints who can defeat the culture of death. And as St. Basil the Great says, lay this world at Christ's feet.
You've just spoken about Notre Dame.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the question earlier on tolerance. You gave a response that was satisfactory in terms of I differ with you in your views, but that's not reason for me to bash your head and do you in. But then you went on to talk about the importance of recognizing genuine difference. And you used the analogy of a physician and a herbalist. And the assumption in that part of your response was that you are a physician who is practicing according to, what is generally accepted medicine that's effectual at a particular time. And the other person is the herbalist. Well, why make that assumption? What if you are in a situation where somebody else thinks you are the herbalist and they are the ones with the genuinely effective medicine?
Very good question. Notice how I answered the question as posed was first historically, to give what toleration meant. Then I added what I understand a traditional Christian must do, not just not bash the person over the head, but respond in love and kindness while sternly telling them that they're wrong. I think that I, as a physician, based on all that I know, would breach very fundamental obligations if I did not explain to someone who was going to a herbalist for whom I had very good evidence that their treatment would not provide the care and cure that I have. That I would be acting immorally, not to tell the patient, if you don't take the antibiotics, you're going to be dead. And the person who you're talking to might be sweet and nice, but they're wrong. Everything that I know indicates they're wrong. Now that knowing of an empirical sort will never be as strong as the knowing of the theologian in union with God. That person will know God more intimately than knowing of any empirical fact. And will have to turn with full love to that other person and say, you're wrong.
One real quick comment. You're still assuming that you are the one who has the answer, who has the practice that is efficacious.
Absolutely. And I think Christians must assume it. And if they don't, they betray all of Christianity. And I think physicians, when they treat you and it's compatible with all they know, that without this you will die, breach one of the most basic obligations not to tell you that. They must tell you with love and with kindness. But if they fail to tell, they breach a very important physician's obligation. And we as Christians, if you have experienced the living God, you should tell others whatever you experienced is diabolical, which is how Christians responded to those who didn't agree, and call them to the living faith, which is unbroken. Very incorrect, politically insensitive thing to say in our postmodern world. What you have seen here is the ecumenical postulate. Never ever say that you might be right or wrong about religion. Carry it so far as to really say, maybe you should never even say you're right or wrong about the use of antibiotics for subacute bacterial endocarditis. When you've gotten to that point, you've deconstructed the very notion of what it is to find the truth who lives and who is a person, the Trinity.
One last question. I think that you've had your hand up for longest. No, actually, I think you're on the right.
Yes. This is a follow-up on 2 questions about tolerance. How does the world perspective which you laid out
how does that play with regard to hot-button environmental issues? Like, how do you explain how to treat how to deal with the herbalists? How would you deal with the abortionists?
Anybody who's read my book, Foundations of Christian Bioethics, knows that the last chapter, chapter 8, has 2 sections. And the last section has a very long title, which my wife said was too long for anyone to read and stay awake. It ends with St. Autonomous burned down abortion clinics. Now, St. Autonomous was a saint from Asia Minor, died in northern Italy, was killed by Diocletian, was a bishop. He went around and told people not to bust down pagan temples. He said, pagan temples, they worship the devil. But that's not what Christians are supposed to do. You get killed by Diocletian and die as a martyr. That's what your business is. So you turn to that about which people are radically misguided and who will even kill you for being a Christian. And you turn to them. The early Christians did not, were not politically engaged. They changed their hearts and became martyrs. That's not saying that political engagement can, at some points, if it's peaceable, be appropriate. You don't want to get so caught up in politics you forget about worshiping about God. It's becoming holy. It is the fact that saints became holy that the Roman Empire fell. Not because they were writing to their local governor or senator, or they were picketing infanticide or abortion. They were changing their lives and becoming something that the Roman Empire had never seen, holy saints. And that is the remedy, nothing else. Let me thank you all for your patience, for the poor cameraman who has had to take pictures of an ugly Texan wandering back and forth. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you so very much.